Mr. Christian, kindly give me an explanation.
With the sea, with the water.
Williams has been drinking seawater, sir. I was giving him some fresh water. I'm afraid he'll die without it.
You'll give no one water without my permission. Take that ladle below.
Yes, sir.
You bloody bastard! You'll not put your foot on me again.
Hello, welcome to episode 25 of Film Gold, and this is a discussion about Mutiny on the Bounty, the 1962 version starring Marlon Brando, Trevor Howard and Richard Harris. This is just a quick intro because this is another from the archives of my guest appearances on film podcasts. This was recorded in 2020 and is once again a collaboration with Scott Phipps, and there's also Steven Byford in there, who was in with Scott for episode 13 of this podcast about sleuth. Scott currently has, I believe, 4 podcasts and a chart show. The main 3 podcasts he runs are The Stinking Paws, which is what you're going to hear now. We originally recorded this for Stinky Paws. Real Britannia, which he does with Stephen, which is a very British podcast about very British movies. Rainbow Valley, which is the one where I first discovered him. That's all about the 60s. And then he also contributes to the Talking Pictures TV podcast, which is linked to the TV channel of the same name in England. And recently Scott has started the Rainbow Valley Chart Show, which I believe is on Mixcloud. It'll all be in the show notes, of course. So yes, this discussion is focused on the 1962 version of the story, as I said, of HMS Bounty. And that was the middle version of the main 3 film versions, which spanned from 1935 to 1984. But apparently, as you'll hear, there were other versions as well. It's obviously a very compelling story of mutiny, of course, and apparently authoritarian rule, and I suppose also really the tension of being at sea for long stretches of time, especially living in cramped and uncomfortable quarters as the common seamen did, while the officers obviously had much better quarters and their own rooms. A bit similar to the Titanic, really, in that you've got people in very different conditions, essentially living close to each other, but with that bit of distance between them. And of course there are class elements as well. The end of the real story, the aftermath of the mutiny, is mysterious as well in terms of the details and the fact of different accounts of what happened. So that's ripe for different film adaptations as well. We talk, of course, about Marlon Brando and what he got up to during the making of this film. It's funny, actually, that the 2 films that really made him, quote, box office poison were One-Eyed Jacks and this film. And both of them involved him being close to beaches, so we wonder whether he sat on the beach in Tahiti waiting for the right wave, which is a famous story from when he was making One-Eyed Jacks and ended up being the director, of course. If you're interested in Marlon Brando, I did a 2-parter with David Ghosty Wills, episodes 11 and 12. So here's the show. I think it went out late 2020, but I remember us recording it in the summer, I think, or the autumn. I haven't listened back to it in its entirety, but I remember there are some reminiscences about watching films on video as kids and the primitive equipment we had to use then. And I think we also speculated towards the end of the conversation on what could be done with the Bounty story in the future, because it's clearly got legs, sea legs, if you will. I'll just say before I finish this intro that if you think Captain Bligh was just a tyrant who deserved to have a mutiny against him, you might feel differently after you hear this, and we bring a fair bit of evidence to support what might be a more truthful portrait of Captain William Bligh. I'll be back soon with this podcast, probably for the audio version of Sorcerer with Luke Thompson. We put it out on video a few months ago and it was a very freewheeling and quite rambling conversation, so I'm going to apply the scissors to it and put out a slightly different version of it. So see you soon, and I now leave you in the capable hands of Scott Phipps with myself and Stephen on The Stinking Paws. Enjoy.
All sounds Scotty.
Take your stinking paws off me, you damn dirty ape!
Good morning, it's the Stinking Paws podcast. Scott here as usual. I'm joined by two mutinous dogs this morning, Antony and Steven. Good morning.
Hello, how's it going?
The episode that very nearly wasn't, I think we're going to describe this as, this is attempt number 2 to record. It feels like attempt number 22.
Yeah.
At the moment.
Not dissimilar to the production of the film.
It's a long drawn out process. Yeah, long drawn out process today. Fingers crossed, everything's working. We've just had technical issues. People trying to break their way through to Stephen's flat from next door when we tried recording a couple of days ago.
They're trying to steal his breadfruit, I think.
I hope that's not a euphemism.
No.
Stephen's breadfruit is legendary in York, ladies and gentlemen, isn't it? Now, as you may or may not know, Steven is my co-host on a little thing we do called the Real Britannia podcast, which is all about British movies. And today's movie could quite easily fall into that wheelhouse, mate.
It could, but we decided to jump ship.
We did. The metaphors are going to be fly thick and fast today, aren't they? It's going to just...
And yes, so we're bringing this to the Stinking Paws audience to give them a taste of what the discussions can be on the Real Britannia, especially when we have a particular third sail with us.
There we go. This is going to be good today, I can tell. And it's Antony, the host of Glass Onion on John Lennon, who has been a guest on Stinking Paws previously, haven't you, mate? But also Real Britannia a few times.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
4 or 5.
It's your choice today as well. So the main reason I think you chose it is A, it's one of your favourite movies. B, it stars Brando, I believe, is your favourite actor. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, he's probably the along with John Lennon, obviously, who's the subject of my podcast. Probably the cultural. Don't know. I use the word hero a little bit lightly, but
touchstone,
cultural figure that I find absolutely fascinating. And I hate to beat the same drum, but this is another one of those childhood films that it's very hard to have an objective view about it because it's so sort of entrenched.
Yeah.
My sisters and my parents, as a family, we used to watch this just over and over again. And I'm not even sure if we thought it was a great film then, but
Is it strange how things do that? Yeah, I think me and Stephen have had the conversation before where there's films that are generally perceived by people to be classics and are worthy of rewatching, and you can understand why people go back to them again and again. But then everybody has got 1, 2, possibly 3 movies that are just outside of that little Venn diagram that you will watch again and again because it will click with you memory-wise, Stephen. Is that right? I think mine, for some reason, is probably one of the worst musicals ever made, which is Paint Your Wagon.
Yeah, there certainly is, these touchstones from particularly childhood or your early experiences in life where they take you back. And a lot of what we do on the Real Britannia is films that aren't objectively good films, but films that we enjoy, particularly the cliched, rainy bank holiday films.
How many times we said that on the show, the rainy bank holiday movie.
A cliche wouldn't be a cliche if it wasn't true. And we have those go-tos that you want to go and watch when either you can't decide what else to watch or you just fancy revisiting, or there are some films that are even ones that when you're not actually feeling not very well, you just stick on because it's almost like comfort food to just watch. That's it. So there are those films that might not be objectively great and are open to criticism from less sort of kindly eyes, or ones that are less bought into it. It's like a family dog, that might be scruffy and one-eyed and leaks a bit on the carpet and that kind of stuff, but you still love it and wouldn't replace it for anything else,
Yeah, I suppose you've got an unconvincing British accent, that kind of thing. No,
Some people have told me I have, yeah.
I think the other thing is the seafaring thing, and Jaws is another one of my obsessive films, objectively considered a really good film, but there's something about the sea and the ocean that fascinates me as well, so that's another reason.
Lots of it all ties together to make the ultimate movie for you, basically. It's got Brando, it's got seawater, and
That's it.
We all have
bad British accents.
Bad British accents.
I mean, we just used to, I don't know if you did the same, you guys, but we had a limited number of films on VHS. We just watched them to death. Yeah. We watched them as a family. I think that's another big thing.
Yeah,
that people don't do anymore.
Yeah, I had that with my household because we were limited. But I think Scott was a bit different because of his his family having access to all the latest films. Coming through the door. For a different reason. So there was always new films to watch, I think, in Scott's household.
That was the thing. Classic movies weren't really watched because we had access to things that weren't even released at the time, because of that window between America releasing a movie and us could be up to a year sometimes, couldn't it? Do you remember that? Yeah. We're talking early 80s. I remember E.T. took 6 to 8 months or something to come over, but we had a copy pretty much immediately,
Well, I think the other thing, I mean, we've laughed. Is there a name for those terrible early VHS? Is it top loader? Is that what you call them?
Yeah, top loader. Yeah, we had a top loader.
You stick them in, and then you have to wait. It feels like you're waiting half an hour. But no one would bother anymore for the thing to very, very slowly go into the machine and start playing.
If the spring went, you used to have to put something weighty on top of it to keep the top down. Yeah.
But there's something about that gives you, I don't know, it makes you appreciate it a bit more.
A bit like vinyl, isn't it?
You know what I mean?
Yeah, a bit like putting a classic album.
It's the same as if you go and put the video in and find out that the previous person hasn't rewound it. So you have to sit there for 2 minutes while it rewinds, and that builds the anticipation.
The longest 2 minutes of your life when you're about 12 years old, isn't it? Waiting for the video to rewind. A bit like a ZX Spectrum trying to load a game. Yeah.
From a tape.
Also, we have a bit of a family joke that my mum would occasionally accidentally record episodes of Neighbours or Coronation Street in the middle of a classic film.
See, we all had our own. We had our own blank tapes, of our names on it, But yeah, you'd sneak over and nick your brother's one and say, "No, I'm just going to tape over that."
We had a series of blank VHSs that had been recorded onto, and they all had from the little stickers that you got with the things that you had numbers in there, so you could put on the front of them on the spines what number tape it was, and then we had a little book that was the same size as like a pocket diary that had what was on the actual tapes in there on a different page for each number, it written on and then crossed out and then written on or rubbed out in pencil or whatever. So yes, it was all catalogued in. My father was a bit more of that mind as well, with lists, I think, which is where I got it from. Great so yes, it had to be recorded.
I know we're sort of drifting onto like 80s video habits here, but do you remember those plastic cases that people would have that made them look like expensive books? You could disguise them on your shelf so it looked like part of this extensive library that you got, but really they were cheap plastic like video cases that had like leather
that's
effect. That's
what me and you need to do now as a background behind us when we're on Zoom calls in this current climate. We need to make it look like we've got an expensive library, but actually it's full of videos,
dodgy VHSs. I remember all that. And this is not a typical 80s generation movie. This isn't a John Hughes movie or an Arnold Schwarzenegger or anything like that. But as you say, it's personal to you, Antony, which is why you brought it to the table, and that's what we like, because then we're going to inject a bit of passion into this, hopefully, or one of the three of us is going to inject a bit of passion into this movie, and it'll be great to hear why, because everybody, as we say, has their own thoughts, their own particular comfort movies. I mean, Paul, my co-host on this show, my regular co-host, his bizarre one that he always turns to is I, Robot, starring Will Smith. Now, how obscure is that? For me, it might be the King Kong remake for some reason. If like you said, if you're ever stuck...
Which one, though? I like the 1976 one, actually.
I like all
that
versions.
That one on another tangent. But.
Yeah. Anything to do with giant monkeys, apparently. People take the piss out of me. Or talking monkeys, because I love the Planet of the Apes series, and I love every single version of King Kong that's ever been made.
And then,
that ape at the beginning of...
Yes, and Clyde, yes.
You know that ape at the beginning of 2001?
I think you've interviewed him, haven't you?
Oh, yeah. I wasn't going to mention it, but, Daniel Richter.
See, the conversation always turns back to people in monkey suits on this film. It used to, anyway.
Well, I always work it to the Beatles, but I'll try not to.
Are there any Beatles connections in this? We're talking 1962. Let's find out.
Came out,
Yeah, let's find out. I'll tell you what.
Some of these sailors must have had a hard day's night.
Oh, here we go.
They were so poor they used to eat bread fruit, back in Liverpool. Because Liverpool's a port, so it was coming in regularly.
I'm sure on the ship there was plenty of beetles. So.
Yeah, as well. Actually, I just found a connection there. The Tahitian extra. I was going to mention this later, but one of the production problems was that the Tahitian extras used to eat beetle nuts. B-double-E-T.
Well done.
And so their teeth were black, and so they had to fly in. They flew in 5,000 temporary dentures from the USA. But the extras, you put them on, and they were so fascinated by it that they just go off. They had mirrors as well on the island.
Yeah.
They'd go off and just admire themselves for hours.
And run off with teeth.
Yeah.
There's a lot of silly stories and a lot of fascinating trivia associated with this movie, as I found out after watching it. I'll tell you what we'll do. Let's find the trailer, or we'll find some dialogue. We'll find some of that interesting accent that Marlon Brando has got throughout this movie, perhaps. We'll be back after this. It's Mutiny on the Bounty, 1962.
Trailer.
On December 23rd, 1787, His Majesty's ship Bounty sailed from England bound for the South Seas. En route, there began a fantastic series of historical events as men, driven to desperation, plunged into the unknown. A series of events that culminated in the most famous mutiny in history. The dramatic story of that mutiny has, for more than a century, excited the imagination of men, women, and children the world over. From initial conception to completion, Mutiny on the Bounty has been an unprecedented and exciting adventure in the history of picture making. The Bounty herself, built in historic shipyards in Lunenburg, Nova Scotia. The first ship ever to be built from the keel up, especially for a motion picture. Then, across the world, a truly global project to the actual locales, the islands of Tahiti and Pitcairn. Tahiti. For generations, the dream island of the Western world. A land of easygoing, fun-loving people. A land that has always represented escape from civilization. A land where there is no time, no tomorrow, only today. Now Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer crystallizes the lure of adventure that beckons from beyond the horizon in one of the most extraordinary motion pictures ever made. Like all great motion pictures, Mutiny on the Bounty is a story of people.
You're going too lightly, Quintal.
A story of provocative and colorful characters brought to life by unforgettable star personalities. Marlon Brando is Fletcher Christian, an officer and a gentleman, yet a man among men.
In my years of service, I have never met an officer who inflicted punishment upon men with such incredible relish.
Trevor Howard is the infamous Captain Bligh, relentless and cruel.
Mr. Christian!
Richard Harris portrays the reckless John Mills.
The men are all, Mr. Christian!
And there is Tarita, alluring daughter of an exotic land.
Fletcher Christian is my name.
Is my name?
No. Fletcher.
No. Fletcher.
It is a matter of supernatural indifference to me whether you contaminate the natives or the natives contaminate you. I have but one concern. Our mission. Let any one of you provoke an incident which endangers it, and I shall cause that man to curse his mother for giving him birth.
You remarkable pig. You can thank whatever pig god you pray to, you haven't quite turned me into a murderer.
Mutiny on the Bounty thrills with moments that will live forever in your memory.
Mutiny on the Bounty, released in the UK the 19th of November 1962. Directed by Lewis Milestone and Carol Reed, which we will be talking about here. Starring, of course, Marlon Brando, Trevor Howard, Richard Harris, Hugh Griffith, Richard Haydn, Tarita, Percy Herbert, Duncan Lamont, Gordon Jackson. It could have been a Real Britannia movie, but it's not. It's a Stinking Paws movie. It's Antony's choice. Antony, could you give us the synopsis, please, mate?
Absolutely, yeah. In 1787, British ship Bounty leaves Portsmouth to bring a cargo of breadfruit from Tahiti. But the savage onboard conditions imposed by Captain Bligh trigger a mutiny led by Officer Fletcher Christian. It's Bligh's first command. It's soon apparent that he is happy to hand out severe punishments for the most minor infraction. The welfare of his men is also not of primary concern to him. All this not only puts him in conflict with the seamen, but with his first lieutenant, Fletcher Christian. It's kind of a mixture of the two there.
Oh, that's fine. That summed it up. I mean, it's quite a familiar story to people of our generation. Yeah, I would say it's probably not. So it's not something that's taught in schools today, is it?
I don't think. No, I don't think so. I don't think it was considered a major event for a long time. It's one of those things that probably through, I guess, the books that came out before these films. But obviously, it's an amazing. I guess we'll talk about the real story later, but it's an amazing story.
yeah. It's not only the story of the mutiny; it's the survival story and how misrepresented and misunderstood Captain Bligh is in a lot of these movies as well.
Yeah,
that's right.
I think that the fame of the story was initially, straight away when it happened, it was absolutely to do with Bligh and the way that he'd survived with the seamanship and etc.
Yeah,
and he was actually almost a hero figure. Then it went into obscurity and only came back when the triptych of novels were written earlier in the 20th century, which were then developed into the films that we which this is a remake of. So absolutely, I think there was 100 years or more where it was basically in obscurity, and now the Mutiny on the Bounty more has, people have heard of the Mutiny on the Bounty, but knowing any details about it, I think it is more, from the films, if they do know the films, but otherwise they've got no real idea about what it was all about anyway.
Yes. Yeah.
Nowadays, it's been lost in that. It's just a touchstone reference rather than the understanding. As revealed recently by the President of the United States, Donald Trump has made a reference to it and completely turning around the actual implications of Mutiny on the Bounty and not realising he was positioning himself as being the villain of the piece, really.
Right. Oh, really? What did he say then?
Point.
What did he say then? Did he refer himself to Fletcher Christian or something?
He was saying about the Mutiny on the Bounty and making reference to the governors of various states, the Democratic governors who were rebelling against the attempt to reduce any kind of lockdown and any kind of fight against the coronavirus. Their joint action to try and resist him, he described that as like a mutiny on the Bounty, and not realising that they needed their captain and all this kind of stuff. Positioning himself as Bligh, but not realising that in the public consciousness of those that do know of the story, as far as the films go, that he was very much the villain of the piece was Bligh. So the actual cultural reference point for Mutiny on the Bounty just seemed to have been lost on some people.
Well,
can you just say off the bat that for people who want to know the real story, definitely the most realistic is the third version of the story, isn't
yes,
it? And the Bounty from 1984.
Well, is it the third version? Because there's 5 editions of this, isn't there? Right. I mean, everybody remembers the Charles Lawton, Clark Gable. They remember this, and they remember the Anthony Hopkins, Mel Gibson. But wasn't there an Errol Flynn version and another as well?
There was two others, yeah. I think they were both before the Clark Gable one.
Before the first one,
Right, okay.
I think one of them was very short because of the filmmaker at the time. It was all short films, and I think these are the 3 that people are talking about. The ones that are,
we'll refer to these as
based upon the books, and then attempts at remakes of the previous ones that were based on the books, sort of thing, rather than those originals. But I mean, the books themselves aren't necessarily so to be taken as being the true story. It's an account. It's a fictionalized account, isn't it? So,
yeah. Well, for the sake of this podcast, we'll just refer to the big three, I think, rather than the two that we're not that aware of or are lesser seen. So, obviously, yes, 1962. It's a rehash. It's a readaptation. I mean, how familiar are we with the three versions? Let's turn to Antony first, because I know this is your favourite version, but then knowing you go and you seek out everything that you devour all information about any movie that grabs you with a passion. And I know that you have seen the Anthony Hopkins one several times because you like that as well, I'm aware. But what about the earlier one, the 30s one with Clark Gable?
I don't know it so well. No. I'm not the world's biggest Clark Gable fan. I'm open to that being changed. But I would say, this version is the one that's sort of closest to my heart. But I did actually, years ago, me and a couple of friends, we watched all three, and we decided the best combination was Brando's Christian, perhaps taking it a bit more seriously than he did this time. And but definitely Anthony Hopkins as Bligh, I thought is spectacular. And Mel Gibson was all right as well. So I'm very familiar with the one we talk about today in the 1984 version, definitely. First one, tell me about the first one, because I'm not so familiar with it.
I think it's probably my favourite of the three.
Right.
But then that all goes back to my love of classic Hollywood, and I think it's the version I saw first. It is. Thinking about it, I think, do you know what? I saw this in a very bizarre order. I think I saw that first. Then I saw the 80s one. Then I saw this version.
That makes a difference as well, though, doesn't it?
It does, and they've all got their own merits. They've all got something, remarkable about them. They all tell the story in a slightly different way.
Yes.
Mainly influenced by budget, a lot of it as well. The way we could talk about a potential future, adaptation of the novel and how that would look in this age of CGI and the young Hollywood actors and stuff like that. But this version I've only ever seen 2 or 3 times, and to be honest, it's only been very recently. My first watch was only a couple of years ago of this one. Stephen, what about yourself? Your history with the three?
I think I've seen them in order. I think.
All right. Okay.
My recollection is, I think, definitely the most recent one, the 1980s one, with Hopkins and Gibson. I don't think I saw that until just a few years ago, to be perfectly honest. Whereas the other two, I know I have seen a long time ago. My recollection is that I saw the 1930s one first. So, I mean, as Antony says, that kind of does have a bearing upon how you regard the films as well, if you've which ones you've seen first and such. Yeah. But I completely agree that there was both a budgetary and actual technical improvement gradually as the films were made to allow them to do more and be more realistic. But there was also a creeping attempt to try and be more realistic about the characters and to some extent be more true to the story, which is why you get the more emphasis on certain characters as it progresses, that there's characters that are actually quite intrinsic and important parts of the actual real story that aren't in the first one, and then there's some that are added for this version that we're reviewing now, but still there's some that are missing that are therefore included in the 1980s one. And the different emphasis they also take with regards to the reasons for why there is a mutiny as well. There's a sort of, to some extent, a bit of a reassessment, even though it's the same to some extent through them. Well, it's not quite. It does change over time, but definitely there's an attempt to do something different with each one.
There is one unfortunate kind of whopper in the 1984 film, which is that they have Bligh wanting to go back around the horn.
Yes.
Which is total bullshit. And I mean, I think it's a bit unfortunate that they went for this realism. They could have found some other reason why they would mutiny. But the idea that Captain Bligh would want to go back round the horn, I don't know, to punish them, to... I think one of the versions, perhaps the one we're talking about today, I've lost track a little bit, has Bligh going a different route because he wants to circumnavigate the globe to emulate Magellan. I can't remember which film that is.
I think it's this one that set out at the beginning. That's he makes a failed attempt to go around the horn, and that then wastes time, but also causes people to die, and that's seen as being his own personal ambition to be, a circumnavigator of the globe, which doesn't tie in with, and we'll get onto this later on. It doesn't tie into the actual facts of the matter and realism. But I think that this one has that, and the third one included that, whereas in most of the instances, the third one was a bit more truer to facts. So it was a shame they did sort of spoil it a bit with that. I agree with what you're saying.
Yeah, but they really, I don't know, they've just really captured something. And Mel Gibson's pretty good as well. The only disappointing, the romance with the King's daughter becomes, I think in that podcast recommended, that History by Hollywood, they said it was like Love Story, but I think it was a bit more like the Blue Lagoon.
It was a bit like the Blue Lagoon. Yeah.
Just becomes a slightly ridiculous thing. Other than that, I thought the 84 film, the old film, the inconsistency I was going to mention with that is that in the real story, the HMS Pandora was the ship that was sent to Tahiti to basically try and round up the mutineers, and in the old film, quite conveniently, Captain Bligh captains that as well.
That's right.
So he reunites with the mutineers in Tahiti, which didn't quite happen, but it's quite funny, artistic license.
Liberties are taken with all versions.
Absolutely, and as we've said many times, in 1935 they wouldn't have been expecting people to have VHS recorders and the internet and all that kind of thing. It wasn't done for that reason. It was done.
You went to the movies to be entertained. That's right,
exactly,
mate. And yes, who cares if Charles Lawton jumped back on a boat and immediately went chasing back after him? That's what was expected. As you guys are aware, I do another podcast called Rainbow Valley, and one of the episodes I did was on the making of Cleopatra, which also came out this year, I believe, wasn't it? It's around about this sort of time.
It was, it
came out the next year, I think.
But the production on it was years and years in advance,
It started in about 1948, I think.
I think that the what you may be getting to, it might be preempting you and stepping on your toes, but one of the things is that I think the two films, this and Cleopatra, were linked by the fact that it was big budget, historical, epic telling, and there was a lot of stories floating around about the fact that the difficulty of getting it shot and the demands of the stars who were being prima donna-ish and delaying things and causing problems on sets, and that's the link between the two, which you covered obviously in your wonderful show.
Thank you.
Of the Rainbow Valley, and will maybe cover less well here.
You've got to remember, right, we're talking 1962 like that, so from the mid-50s, where television had reared its ugly head and was a real major force in competing against the movie-going public, movie makers had to come up with something spectacular. So you get widescreen, you get stereo sound, cinemascope, all of this came in, and from about 1959, where it really hits the peak with, say, Ben-Hur, everything after that tried to emulate the success of Ben-Hur if they were making a big Hollywood production, an epic. Everything had to be 3 hours plus. It had to be in CinemaScope. It had to have these exotic locations. And in a lot of cases, they fell foul of their own ambition. This particular movie is no exception, with technical woes, casting issues, casting relationships. There are some interesting stories and behind the scenes stuff going on throughout this movie, mate, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, I'd recommend anyone obviously to search this out for themselves, but where should we start? Marlon Brando, I guess.
Yeah, but this is probably the main point of main reason for you choosing the movie. So,
well, one of the things that was very interesting is that I first watched this film when I was like 10 or 11. As I said, we used to watch it as a family. I'd never actually seen any other Brando films, so I didn't know he was American
right.
to begin with. Then my dad put me right and showed me The Godfather and everything else. But it was so funny that it's so strange that even at that age, I think we all felt that Brando was taking the piss out of the film. Well, taking the piss out of us. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Even at that young age, I just felt that, like, I just had this sense that he wasn't trying to do a good accent. He was just trying to do this ridiculous. And I think the line that we always, in this version of the film, the guy starts drinking seawater.
Yes.
And Brando, Christian gives him fresh water. Bligh kicks the ladle away, and then Brando gives Bligh a sort of backhand slap. Yeah. But the line we always used to laugh at was, Williams has been drinking seawater, sir. Just how ridiculous.
It still hit home with me that I've only seen this a couple of times, 2, 3, 4 times possibly. And the very first line, which I cannot remember, but the second Brando opens his mouth, it takes you out of the movie.
That's what I mean. It's a kind of a comedy. I think we always regarded this as a sort of unintentional comedy in a funny way. We took it as that.
Do you think he was just given instructions on the script to say that, okay, Brando is this upper-class officer, blah, 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 and he's misinterpreted it somehow?
I think Marlon Brando, if I can just go deep for a second, I think he was mostly motivated by anger, because I've read loads about him. Yeah. And I think this was just his way of saying, can we swear or not? Saying just fuck off.
Yep.
Fuck off. I'm going to hijack this because I'm Marlon Brando and I'm an angry guy. And I think he just did it to annoy them, honestly.
Wow. Okay.
That podcast, History by Hollywood, did this brilliant description of Brando when he appears as a cross between a leprechaun and a superhero.
Yeah, when he turns up in the
because he's got the cape and he's carrying a cane and it's brilliant. I love it. It's actually funny. There's a couple of parallels with Apocalypse Now. One of them being Marlon Brando, obviously, but also the fact the production got caught in the rainy season.
Oh right,
and it went on and on and on. But Brando, that's what I mean. I think he was just trying to give the establishment as hard a time as possible because, I mean, his fee apparently was $500,000 plus 10% of the gross, and I think that was one of the first times that an actor got, a cut of the gross. But he also got $5,000 a day for every day that the production run over schedule.
Oh, the parallels between this and Elizabeth Taylor are frightening. Actually, you saying this,
but guys, we're talking about $5,000 a day in 1962.
Well, we could buy a house.
How much
for
is that?
Yeah.
How much is that now? I don't know, $100,000 a day.
And no wonder he managed to buy the Tahiti Islands.
There you go. But of course, the other parallel with Apocalypse Now is that he would ad-lib and he would stall, partly to piss everyone off, partly for the money. It's exactly what he did to Francis Ford Coppola in Apocalypse Now, and it's fascinating. Yeah. There are other things. I mean, he didn't learn the lines properly, and you must have heard of his famous line learning thing where he'd stick the lines on like dummy cards to the furniture,
yes.
Or he'd even ask an actor if he could stick the lines on his forehead.
Yeah.
So if you watch Brando, often you'll see his eyes just go up because the lines on the forehead of the guy he's talking. And I don't know.
It's incredible because he wasn't the biggest star in Hollywood at the time, but he was fairly big, wasn't he? I mean, we're talking On the Waterfront was 10 years before this, wasn't it? 54, 55?
54.
Yeah.
54, yeah.
We had Guys and Dolls and a few other things in between. And am I right in saying that this is the movie that not necessarily killed his career, but led to that 10-year sort of fallow period before The Godfather?
It is commonly seen that way as being the one that sort of made him poisonous to work with. Not just because of the fact that this film maybe financially didn't do what they were hoping it was going to do, especially with him taking a cut of it, but also his behaviour made it the people who decided director-wise and star-wise decided that they'd rather just not work with him. So it really wasn't until The Godfather where there was some kind of rehabilitation, I think.
Yeah, I mean, box office poison is what they always say, isn't it?
Yeah,
he became, and I think absolutely this was this alienated him massively, and
I'm sure he will have decided that was everybody else being wrong rather than him, though. He's that type, isn't he? From what you.
He's a funny mixture because he was quite deep as well, and he got involved in civil rights. I think he did actually want to change the world. He's one of those people, but he couldn't deal with his own life, and he, two alcoholic parents, and you probably know the story, but very, very complex person, but just endlessly fascinating. And the thing is, I mean, those films, as you said, between 62 and 72, they're not great, but there's one called Burn, which Quemado, I think in Spanish, which I'd recommend. Okay. And that's where he actually premiered this posh accent.
Oh, right.
Yeah. And he considered it one of his best films, but again, it would just, I mean, for whatever reason, he didn't really have a box office hit, and he made some pretty awful films in that time.
Yeah, I think, wasn't there the Western One-Eyed Jacks and things like that? Or was that later? I can't remember. But
that was before Bounty. That wasn't too bad. I mean, have you seen The Chase, for example?
Oh, long time ago, yeah.
Yeah, that's a very interesting one with a sort of troubled production, and you can kind of see
there's a running theme going through.
Yeah. Well, that wasn't necessarily his fault. I think that was, the script got messed around with, and Brando's this sheriff. It's got a good cast. Got Robert Redford, Jane Fonda, various other people.
I know the one.
But when you watch it, it's like a lot of his films. It just seems like a big missed opportunity. Like there's flashes of the old Brando, because he built such a reputation based on basically 4 films, really. I mean, well, let's think: The Men, Viva Zapata, Streetcar, On the Waterfront. Just those 4 films had given him such a reputation that. They let him get away with a lot, but in the end they just wouldn't, because
Hollywood was changing.
Money.
The studio system, this was the beginning of the end for the studio system. This was sort of highlighted by, the making of Cleopatra that nearly led to the downfall of Fox at that point, right. And it's not until about 5-6 years later when we start getting the new bucks in town. You start getting people like your Spielbergs and your Coppolas and all these guys that start making Bonnie and Clyde and the Wild Bunch and Easy Rider, the Easy Rider Raging Bull generation, as you like to refer to it, Antony. That whole lot creep in, and the studio system just collapses almost. And this is the beginning of the end. And the 60s, people sort of say, the golden age of Hollywood was over, all these big productions. But when you look at some of the massive epics that came out in the 60s, it was a second golden age almost, because, as I say, we were competing with television. And, Lawrence of Arabia was this year. Even the musicals were big and they were bold and they were wide. Sound of Music a couple of years after this, Oliver, West Side Story, they were huge productions. They were made at the expense of some of the more lesser movies, the more creative movies, probably more interesting movies, if truth be told, in favour of these big, overblown blockbusters that, when you look into it, quite a few of them turned around and bit the Hollywood studios on the arse. A troubled production.
To say the least.
To say the least. I mean, 2 directors, which, again, similarities with Cleopatra again. Originally, now, Stephen, it was Carol Reed, who,
yes,
famous British director, left for, I've got it here, it says an undisclosed ailment.
Gallstones, I've got here. Yeah. Gallstones in inverted commas. Yeah.
Do we read
he wanted
between
to spend
the lines?
More time with his family.
Yeah, do we read between the lines here, guys?
So.
Trouble production is screaming out all here. See, I'd have thought, when you hear trouble production and that they built the Bounty, they built that ship, didn't they, from scratch? You think, oh, okay, well, that will be the start of it. The boat took 2 years longer to make than they planned. It didn't. That was the only thing that sort of went to plan, was the construction of the Bounty itself, wasn't it? I think that was commissioned, built in Nova Scotia, and boom, it was ready.
Well, there are a couple of other things, actually. I mean, when they got to Tahiti, the sand, rather than being white sand, was black powdered lava.
Yes.
So they had to get tons of white sand flown in. I mean, I'd be fascinated to see the production. I actually got a student, because I'm an English teacher, who actually works on films. And I can't imagine how stressful this kind of thing is when you're talking about these amounts of money. And you've got to get, what was that said earlier? 5,000 temporary dentures flown in from America.
Incredible, isn't it? What's that John Wayne movie where they flew the sand in and it was radioactive?
I don't know.
And all the cast developed cancer.
Yeah, I can't.
I can't remember. It was something. It was like a desert western, wasn't it, or something, Stephen?
Yeah.
Possibly. And basically, what they did, Antony, they got this sand flown in, but they flew it in. I might be wrong here, but Stephen, sort of aware of the story, I can tell. Wasn't it from the nuclear testing grounds in Nevada or somewhere?
Yeah, where that was back in the time where they basically had some swimming goggles that were made out of sunglasses was enough to protect you from looking at a mushroom cloud going off on the horizon.
Yeah.
And the fact that it blew your hair back was just meant you needed to recomb. Well, not that you were suddenly going to go away and develop some awful mutations and cancer and stuff, which subsequently happened.
It did.
Just hide behind a brick wall was
duck and hope for the best. But
I mean, there's other things as well. I mean, Brando was also gaining weight. I mean, obviously we know famously became very obese when he was older.
Yeah.
And he apparently went through, I'm going by this Brando biography that seems to be fairly accurate. He went through 52 pairs of trousers.
What, just in this movie?
How can that be true? Surely not. Let's say maybe not 52, but a few.
What, because he needed different sizes?
because they kept growing, because he did spend, there's tales of him spending, a maximum of actual 2 hours being available for shooting each day, the rest of the time he was basically enjoying himself, which was laying around and eating and sleeping. So that would gain the weight.
Lockdown. We're all going through it at the moment.
Yeah.
Of course, he didn't want to get off the island. That's the thing. That's the other reason he was messing around with the script, ad-libbing, because he wanted to stay there longer and get paid for it. He's
excellent.
Quite canny.
Oh, of course he is. Was he first choice for the role? Because Trevor Howard wasn't. It was Peter Finch was first choice, wasn't
That's right. I'm not sure. I do know that Brando was offered Lawrence of Arabia, wasn't he?
Yeah, so
but I believe he was from the beginning. He was mentioned as a possible.
Yeah.
But whether that was their first choice or not, but certainly he was in the frame from the beginning, even if he wasn't the primary choice.
Yeah.
So I mean, all this production stuff, it wasn't all Brando's fault, but I think he did drive everyone mad. I mean, I've heard Trevor Howard talked about it, Richard Harris, just making life unbearable for people, the other actors.
I'm wondering if there was this bit of a division as well between the British crew and the cast mainly, and it is mainly British crew, isn't it? When you look at it, the cast list here is mainly British famous faces. And then it's, this uppity, obstinate American, young star is throwing a spanner in the works. Where I can imagine that, again, Stephen will probably back me up on this one as well. Back in Britain, where everything's run by the unions and you had to stop for tea breaks, and that was true though, wasn't it? The British studio system, they knocked it on the head dead on 5 o'clock, didn't they? And Hollywood productions were really frustrated by things like that. So you can imagine that the British, like Trevor Howard, that was used to that sort of system, to have somebody disrupt it must have been really frustrating.
Yeah, and the actors had developed more pull as far as making sure that there wasn't the repercussions on them from demands of the director or studios or whatever, that they weren't being put out and messed around, and then to have one of their own, as it were, as another actor being the one that was the cause of this, particularly with the directors having more sympathy towards them as well. I think that it did put that division in there, probably. I mean, you've got to look at the cast, like you've said, and realise that 95% of the cast were either British or Tahitians.
Yeah.
And there's this small complement, and particularly as leading that being Marlon Brando, who was really the focal point of the rest of them suffering, really, due to his antics. The parallels again with some of his other films later on, Apocalypse Now and stuff, was where he ended up having to do scenes and do lines and stuff whereby he was shooting them on his own, and the camera was on him, and the actual other person wasn't in shot because they weren't willing to actually perform with him. But towards the end, really.
As you guys know, sometimes difficult circumstances create, great art. And I mean, Apocalypse Now, basically, he didn't, and he was supposed to be in shape, because this is obviously Kurtz was an ex-Special Forces in the story.
Instead of in shadows.
He turns out really fat with a shaved head, but they turned him into a kind of Buddha figure. I mean, it was genius, and the way it was lit.
Well, that's it. He was in the shadows, wasn't he? That's the thing. They hid him. But that is that classic scene when he first appears out of the dark.
And the bald head.
Yeah, and that's what people remember. The sweating bald head.
That creativity, it's the same as with Jaws, where the animatronic didn't work properly, so they decided to not show it as much, and that limited amount of screen time actually made it more intriguing and more full of impact, really. But with regards to this, I'm sure that there is no loss of love between Brando and some of the other actors. I mean, there are stories which I'm sure Antony's got more details of than I have, of not so much Trevor Howard, who I think would probably been quite British, stiff upper lip and just sort of quietly raised inside his own head about it, or maybe in a diary, rather than actually react to Brando. Even though you could see that there was possibly antagonism that was maybe useful for the acting experience, but certainly I think with Richard Harris there was more. And I mean, there were stories of where there was character confrontation between Richard Harris and Marlon Brando, and Richard Harris basically just taking the piss out of Brando in order to try and get him to actually do the fight scene more authentically, because he was so limp-wristed in the way he slapped him or whatever, and Brando just not getting it, that he was taking the piss out of him, really. So I think there was antagonism abound wherever Brando went, really, apart from maybe to the Tahitians, who might have been the only people he got on with. He was decent to.
I think there was a strange admiration going on. Maybe not at the time, but I think years later, when you hear Richard Harris talk about it, he doesn't really sound angry. I think there's enough magic in Brando that they could kind of forgive him almost. I don't know. Maybe I'm biased.
Talking of Mr. Brando's love for Tahiti and all things Tahitian, this is the most fascinating backstory. One of those great bits of Hollywood movie trivia. Now, he was married, wasn't he, at the time, to Movita Castaneda. Who appeared in the 1935 version. She was a bit older than him, was she? 8 years older than him at the time.
So, yeah.
And in the end, he runs off with Tarita. He's the leading Tahitian female lead in this movie, who is many years his junior. She was 18 years younger. There we go. She was only 20 at the time. But isn't that weird, that the link there, that he's married the female lead from 1935 and then leaves her for the female lead of the 1962
And I'm sure if he'd been anywhere near Tahiti in 1984, he would have tried to pull the girl who played Mel Gibson's.
Of course he would have done.
Yeah, probably, because just keeps trading him in for a newer model, obviously.
He liked getting married and having children, did Marlon, yeah. He didn't seem to worry that it complicated his life, basically.
You read the backstory of not only the marriages but the affairs that he had as well. Rita Moreno and Katie Gerardo from High Noon as well. All of these people, he became obsessed with them and pursued them to a certain way. He had a briefer fling with Marilyn Monroe, didn't he? At one point,
he did. Yeah.
We focused a lot here on the backstory, the trivia, the turmoil. As a movie itself, what do we think? Is it a good-looking movie? Is it a great movie? I quite enjoy it as a spectacle.
Can you go first? Because I'm too subjective.
All right, we'll go to Stephen as other guest here today. I mean, forgetting the other two versions that we've been talking about and the backstory and that, mate, what's this like as a movie for you?
It's a beautifully shot epic. Putting aside the questionable characterizations and the even more questionable facts of the actual story, there are some great performances in it. I mean, Trevor Howard probably not fully able to be recognised due to the sort of more strong performances and the characters having more to play with regards to Brando and Harris. Certainly does as much as he can within the sort of cardboard cut out villain of the piece that he's given to work with. I don't think he's given a rounded character to work with. I think he is very much one-dimensional, but I think he still teases what he can out of it just by being an incredible actor that he is. Brando, I do feel miscast, to be honest. I don't think he was the right person for the job on this. Although, if you were going to have the character being played intentionally as they seem to portray him, which is at odds with the truth, like we say. Then even putting aside the actual accent, the portraying the character as a victim, I suppose, and that allowed it to be acceptable that there was some of the scenery chewing that really went on a bit as this torn soul. So it's taken that aspect where it's trying to put across the different psychologies of the main characters, including Richard Harris, who, you know, pretty much a scheming, angry young man that could be taken directly from a number of kitchen dramas, really. I think that they're trying to get more into the psychology of the characters, as opposed to the earlier films. It is one of the things that this film does better than the other two that we might reference. That they're trying to do that. I don't necessarily say that they're accurate in it, but certainly there's an attempt there, rather than the earlier film being simply that it was a sadistic captain and people rebelled against him, or the third film that it was a mixture of people, Christian being in love with a woman and the others just not wanting to go back to their shitty life in England.
Justifiably, I think.
This gets more, attempts to portray a bit more the psychology of the lead characters and that turmoil and conflict. You're putting aside the actual facts, and if you're not treating this as being a portrayal of events, that it's actually a fiction, then it's easier to watch it, and I think enjoy it. Really, it's incredibly long, but for me, if you're able to put aside that, then there are some great scenes in it, some great dialogue, quite tense in certain points. It does unfortunately default a bit too much to whenever there's a lull in the story. That's when the weather starts kicking up. So that there's that side of things. But I think that I can understand why Antony can see this as been something that he took to, especially with the whole heroic sea and then the exoticism of the Polynesian islands and such like, that is something that sat in his psyche and caused him to go back as a family. I could also understand other people who don't take to it at all, to be honest, because they feel it's too long and it's historically inaccurate, and the characterization is a bit too as characters rather than actually having the realism.
Is it sorry to interrupt, mate, because I want to get this in before I forget. Is this the seafaring version of Zulu? But based on what you have just told me there, the characters that are completely wrong, the trouble production, the story has been not tweaked but massively, exaggerated or focused on the wrong things.
Yeah, I wish you'd said this at the beginning. We could have just said this is Zulu at sea, and we could have just left it at a 1 minute review.
But it's also, from what you said, that Antony has had this movie as part of his life for the last 40 years almost. With regard to our Real Britannia review, Stephen, this is a typical rainy bank holiday Sunday movie, isn't it? It's one of those, isn't it? That was always on, like Zulu,
to fill
like
the schedule as much as possible with the minimum amount of things listed in the Radio Times.
Exactly.
And plenty of ad breaks. It's particularly since it's portraying something outside the reality of what is the rain hitting your living room window, so you're being taken on the high seas and to an exotic island. And then there's adventure and peril and that kind of thing going on. So absolutely, this just fits squarely within a rainy bank holiday film.
But it's not boring either. Did you get bored at any point?
I didn't. But a lot of the critics were sort of their main complaint was some of the padding, and one particular one, I wrote this one down. It's from Esquire magazine. MGM spent some 20 million on the film. They could have saved most of it and had a better picture by sticking to the Bligh Christian conflict and omitting the spectacular clutter, as they call it. But I don't think it was cluttered. I think It was knowing that it's a 3 hour plus movie, right, guys? We know what these films are like. You get that whole overture. Did you watch a version that had the overture and the entr'acte and it split in the middle with the intermission and all that lot, guys?
Yeah, the prologue and the epilogue.
Yeah,
they found the gardener on the island.
Yeah, we'll talk about those as well because they weren't included, were they? So you know that up to that first, you're waiting for the intermission, and always in these movies, the first half, it isn't actually a half, it's slightly longer. The first part of the movie is always sort of geared up to nearly 2 hours to give you about an hour and a quarter for the second half of the movie.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, if you look at, where they take the break in a lot of the movies, that first bit is about 3/4, well, not 2/3, say, of the movie. So you know that for the first, couple of hours of this is going to be set on board the ship. You know they're not going to hit Tahiti until that second half almost. And what I think hit home for me in that first half was that they did develop the tensions. It was a slow burn, and it was little minor, well, not minor, but little minor parts of the story that you think, okay, the tension's building. Look at, for example, the whipping scene. We're talking 1962. You would not have got blood in the 1935 version of anybody being whipped.
Yeah. It's gruesome as well.
That's what I mean. That was really effective. The fact that, let's go for this. It's 1962. We can make this quite hard hitting. Even the bit where he casts one of his officers up into the mast overnight. Oh
yeah, it's chilling. Yeah,
and well done. It was actually chilling.
Oh yeah. Actually, I didn't even mean that.
And he comes down, and he can't.
Boom, boom.
Yeah, and he can't move, and it's like. Keep yourself together, man. You're in front.
Come on,
yeah. Keep yourself together, man. And it was that really sort of hit home for me. I mean, as a movie, we know you love this, Antony. Personal thoughts aside, it is a great movie, isn't it? I mean, it's not necessarily just because it's a personal movie to yourself. You like it because of the fact that it's a fine-looking film.
It's a great spectacle, and it's great entertainment. And I can imagine going to the cinema and just absolutely loving this.
Yeah,
but. I mean, there's comedy as well. I mean, Brando's accent for me is basically almost a comedic device, whether it's intentional or not. But the bit with Trevor Howard. I mean, Trevor Howard doing the dance in Tahiti.
Excellent.
Do you remember?
Excellent.
I mean, how fantastic is that? I mean, I think Brando does inject something into it. It's comedy at the beginning, but I think one thing he always portrays well is angst and depression and things like that, because that's who he was. He was seeing a psychiatrist when he was making Streetcar, for God's sake, when he wasn't even 30. He knew about that, and he brought a lot of that. And I mean, the last scene, sorry to cut straight to the last scene, but I mean, it's very moving, when he died, and he was lying on ice, wasn't he, to get that kind of chill, to get the chill of death, so to speak.
That wasn't going to be part of the movie, was it? I think there was a lot of rewrites and a lot of debate going backwards and forwards between the studio and Lewis Milestone that had taken over the directing, and
That's right.
They didn't want it to end on his death scene. That wasn't originally the ending. I can't remember what the original ending was going to be, but that ending is pretty effective, really, isn't it?
I mean, yeah, and I think he really shows the dignity. I mean, I think Fletcher Christian in reality had quite a lot of integrity, apparent according to accounts of the crewmen, and I think Brando really got that out. Because in the 84 version they turn on Christian, don't they, as well?
Yes.
They almost do the same as they did to Bligh. They start getting annoyed with Christian, and they think about mutinying against him.
Well, there's hints of that. There's hints of that in here where he's, down in Bligh's cabin, all aloof, and you could see that developing. But we're well into a 3-hour movie at this point. You have to make the decision. Do we take the story in that direction, or do we focus on the love story? Oh yes, it's 1962. It's an epic. It's cost us 20 million. We need to focus on the love story a bit as well. That's.
I don't feel it is. I don't. The criticisms of fluff in there. I don't feel that is justified, really, because I think it makes for a better story.
Yes.
You could go into the psychological drama of deeper, and if it was in different hands, but would it have justified the epic scale and the scenery shoots and all this kind of stuff, or would it have just been a two-man play based in a cabin? The fluff, as it's called, was made it a more entertaining film, even if it was less realistic. Certainly is needed to be there, and also to make more of the scene setting for the events, even if it wasn't the accurate, it certainly was needed. The poetic license in order to do that is just accepted that's what. Obviously, I mean, this sits in the same realm as the likes of, Pearl Harbor and Braveheart and such, where they're just deciding to just tell the story rather than actually tell what actually happened. So I think that the love story bit was intrinsically necessary for this to be something that would be potentially sold, because you've got to, like Scott said, you've got to remember that people were viewing this by going to the cinema. They weren't going to get a DVD and watch on some streaming service. They were going to go as a date to the cinema.
Yes,
with a boy and a girl usually.
Got to keep her indoors happy, mate.
And,
yeah, that's right.
And so you've got to have it, and particularly since the what was perceived to appeal to females at the time was that it needed a love story or needed some singing and dancing in it, and that so was necessary to inject in, really. Otherwise, you just you make it a heavy drama like a war film that like excludes that audience, which is not what they were wanting to do. It was meant to be an MGM grand epic that was meant to be all things to all people, really.
Yeah. I think the script is, I can't remember offhand, but we used to laugh at some of the lines, and I think there's a bit where does he say to Bligh, "You remarkable pig"?
Something.
I hope you pray to whatever pig god you pray to, or something really silly like. And there are other things. I mean, I think it sacrificed that, because the script. I mean, again, the thing I was listening to today, they talked about 30 rewrites. That might be a bit of exaggeration, but
Oh, I'm not surprised, and I bet a lot of it was written on the fly as well.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah.
I could imagine that a lot of it was written to accommodate, Brando's availability, or his willingness to work on the day, or whatever. But
it was a bit busy some days, sitting on the beach, gazing at the sunset,
eating breadfruit.
Yeah. So there was an outbreak. Of course, the actors on the film were also reenacting the mutineers, and that they got very friendly with the Tahitians, as we know. And there was an outbreak of gonorrhea, perhaps not surprisingly,
across the entire island.
Babies born as well during the production.
Yes. Yeah. It's one of those cases that the backstory is as fascinating as the movie, because it's a sweeping historical epic, and as we've just said, there's dozens of examples of this sort of movie from around that sort of 10-year period, from sort of like 56 up to sort of 66, 67, that it is all widescreen and big spectacular movies. And it's a great little period in Hollywood history, I think, that... Do we see the likes of it anymore? I know, Stephen, you just mentioned, say, Pearl Harbor or Braveheart. We were getting these sort of epics for a while. I mean, have they been replaced by bloody 3-hour Marvel movies now? Is that what we're looking at?
Probably, yeah. I think so.
Yeah, I mean, you're not getting historical ones of this time frame, really. I mean, I think that this kind of thing has actually moved more to being a multi-part series on Netflix or whatever. I mean, you've got the Catherine the Great on, and all these kind of things that are done. And to be perfectly honest, the fact that this is a film that's based upon what was a trilogy of books, and although you can debate the actual content of the books as far as the veracity of the facts, if they actually went back and revisited to make sure it was a bit more factual, they could probably quite easily turn this into quite a gritty multi-series. To be honest, they could probably do
imagine that.
Three series of sort of because you've got the rather overlooked and difficult to tell, I suppose, story of the actual Captain Bligh making it back to civilization. There's more to it than shown in the film, which is a more interesting story, and I think that could, I think if there wasn't another attempt to do Mutiny on the Bounty as a thing, then I think that it should perhaps be done in that context rather than trying to cram it all into a film, because I think that's now with the desire to have a bit more truth in the retelling of history, then I think that it would be better served by having that full amount of time to do it in a multi-part series. And certainly you could have that done quite easily, segment it up into the actual story of them getting to the island being the first series, and then what happens in the months on the island has been the next bit, and then the aftermath being the next series after that, really. I don't think there has been much in this context as far as historical epics being shown in the film, and length of film now it is Marvel films and occasional long dramas about old cowboys, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, we've had a couple that have... Well, no, I wouldn't even say it's come close. I was going to say Dunkirk, but I can't think of anything in recent years that we could compare this to. Anything immediately spring to mind, very recently? I don't think there is there?
I've lost track badly with films the last sort of 5 to 10 years, I'm going backwards to the old ones. But
I can't remember me looking down the cinemas listings and thinking, oh, that looks like a great, good old-fashioned epic.
It's never going to be quite the same because, of course, they're going to use CGI, inevitably.
But
so
I
you're
like
never
that.
Quite get the same thing.
No, but I like the idea that somehow, some of the technical limitations that we had previously could now be overcome a bit more, so you get more of an idea of what actually happened. So, for example, when you see some of these war films now, whereas before it used to be stock footage of Spitfires having a dogfight, or, there would be just one of the last flying Spitfires flying. What was it? Hope and Glory, Stephen. We saw actual real Spitfires flying over. But in this, we could see proper dogfights or whatever, if it's a war film today, from the cockpit, and we could see the actual, the real damage of things that are done. And even, again, say it's a film set in wartime and there's a British street, you'd have one old car because that was all they could find, sitting on the pavement. But with CGI, you can have cars and buses and things going past. So I'd like the idea that historical epics can now recreate a bit more faithfully what has gone on without those limitations.
I'm on the fence about that because as long as it doesn't get too smooth, a good example actually is Titanic. I mean, I'm sure you've reviewed A Night to Remember. I guess you haven't.
We did on Real Britannia.
Yeah, I mean, I think Night to Remember I'd much prefer to Cameron's Titanic, but if you watch Night to Remember carefully, it actually looks more like there's about 400 people on the ship, scrabbling to get on the lifeboats rather than 2,000. So obviously Titanic was better in that regard. But leaving aside the love story, they lost something as well,
Yeah, but that's what I like. I like the fact that you get more of a sense of, wow, there were 1,500 people on board that ship.
Which is right, you can do. You can portray it more. And I mean, the budget and the resources with the third one of these in the trilogy that we're talking about with Mel Gibson and that you've got the Anthony Hopkins arriving at the Admiralty and you've got the wide shot showing there've been plenty of horses and carriages and they've obviously done something to mask out some of the skyline and stuff that would have revealed more modern buildings and stuff in the 80s and so you can have that done. The only thing that I noticed, there was one of the statue in the foreground that had its weather-beaten face that was completely featureless, like a Doctor Who statue, and I was thinking, well, it wouldn't have been featureless at the time because
true.
So, but they would have absolutely added that on with CGI to just that tweak. And I think Scott's got a good point there, where you could feasibly do a passable job that would make it more believable with the CGI, and especially now that CGI has moved into a different realm, I feel, where that when it's done right, it's seamless. You don't notice it's CGI. Whereas go back a couple of years and CGI was always that's CGI.
Titanic was the early days, wasn't it? That cameras like, right, I've got this technology, I'm going to make the movie I always wanted to make. If you even made that now, I like that version of Titanic. I'm sorry, but I do like it. But now, technically, it would look even more spectacular because it does look like a cartoon ship on some of the, the early shots of the sea.
You've got to be really careful then, because then you're making it into something glorious. You know, whereas Titanic was just a horrible story at the end of the day.
Yeah.
It was just an enormously horrible tragedy.
But
no, I totally get it. You know, the technology's there. But, you know, actually, I just thought of a Beatles reference. Yay!
Yeah, go on, we've been waiting all morning. Yeah, go on.
No, it just came to me. No, just to give you an example, the song Day Tripper, there's a point where the right speaker cuts out for like a second on the last verse due to the primitive technology. And, of course, now with all these Beatles remixes, they fixed that. And a lot of fans are kind of annoyed because they're so used to Day Tripper.
Of course.
Listening to it and it cutting out. So all I'm saying is, you know, I think there's a balance to be struck. You know, you shouldn't, as long as it's not just computer geeks working on these stories.
No,
you need a purist working on it as well, you know.
Yeah, I think that's where you've got a difference between doing something brand new, using the technology and resources available, rather than going back and revisiting and digitally remastering and putting CGI onto, say, this version of Mutiny on the Bounty. If they went back and they did some digital effects to make it that Brando's accent was actually English, or stuff like that, then I think that would, absolutely, that would be sacrilege, and you shouldn't do something like that. So there's
bizarre version of auto tuning, you mean?
Yeah, just kind of dubbing in a way, but making
just dub it completely.
Treat it, just have him done by Stephen Fry.
No, they could do, because when they reinstated that missing scene from Spartacus, the snails and the oysters scene, they had the visuals for that, but not the soundtrack. Tony Curtis was still alive, so they got Tony Curtis to dub over the voice, if I remember rightly. But they got Anthony Hopkins to do Laurence Olivier.
Oh yeah, because he was a sort of a protege of Olivier, wasn't he?
They got him to. I'm sure it was Hopkins that did that.
I think you're right. Yeah.
So
amazing.
Referring back,
Olivier and Hopkins both had scenes together in the Bounty, the 80s.
Oh, of course they did. Yeah. Because he was Lord of the Admiralty, wasn't he? Olivier?
Bloody hell, I forgot all about that. Yeah, they did indeed. There you go.
He snuck Sir Larry in there.
That was the era when, you you put him in a film and you've got a movie of worth. That's what they were trying to do with dear old Larry. It was like, we'll get Laurence Olivier or Ralph Richardson, the grand old men of British theatre, get them in.
Well, he had a kind of renaissance, didn't he? Because when they were filming Marathon Man 76, they didn't think Olivier was going to survive much longer.
Yeah.
But he ended up, what did he do? Boys from Brazil.
Fantastic movie. Yeah. He made a few turkeys.
And as we've said previously about, that he took a different turn in his career around about the time of Bunny Lake. He was missing, where he decided to stop doing what is the classics and start
enjoying himself. I think
enjoying himself and applying his classic talent to things that were modern. Which I think was great that he decided to take that turn, because what we then got was a number of films where his presence elevated it massively and
well, to be honest,
I think that set the road as well for other people who also were from the classical tradition, but seeing that they could actually step over that mark and do something modern.
It goes on today,
selling out.
I mean, what he did with Andrew Wyke in Sleuth. I mean, and Michael Caine as well.
Great
Caine, I think, matched him, but that's in my top 10 easily.
Film. Yeah,
because he just gave it a hint of this horrible darkness that probably wasn't in the script.
Yeah, that whole thing about actors, towards the twilight of their careers, just trying anything and everything, just to enjoy themselves, just to let loose a little. It goes on today. I mean, I think we spoke about this, Stephen, before. Someone like, and his name's completely gone. Gandalf. What's his name?
God, what's his name? All three of us had the blank at the same time.
Yep.
Here we go. 1, 2, 3. That guy, yeah.
Ian McKellen.
Thank you, Ian McKellen. Right. A few years ago, he decided, round about the sort of time of Lord of the Rings, right, that's it. I've done Shakespeare. I've done everything. I wanted. So. Didn't he sign up for things like pantomime and
he was in Coronation
Street as well, didn't he?
Oh my God, really?
And then you look at Patrick Stewart now doing a lot more sort of comedies and
does Family Guy, not Family Guy, American Dad,
and it's just like, I've proved I can act. I've done my bit now, and they're just taking the gig that they're having the most fun with. Olivier done that. Trevor Howard did to a certain extent. When you look at the late 70s, the early 80s stuff, he was in things like the Sea Wolves and, those old British sort of military things, that he would still play an older British officer, but they weren't serious British war movies as such. And, fantastic. He was Henry and Rawlinson's End, a prime example, Let's quickly go back to the last of Antony's notes before we start winding this up, because I think we've covered most things as we usually do. We have your pointers from yourself at the beginning, and we sort of touch on them here, there, and everywhere throughout the conversation. Is there anything you've got written down you want to just sort of finish off with, or just sort of touch upon before we wind this up, mate?
A couple of things. Yeah, I mean, just to echo what Stephen said earlier about Bligh. I mean, the main criticism of this film from a realism perspective is just the Bligh as a sort of cartoon villain, and I mean there's so many things that are factually inaccurate, such as he didn't flog people. His actual record of flogging people was less than the average.
Yes,
and
I read that.
He was a far more reasonable person. Also, what this film is missing, which is one of the great parts of the '84 film, is this amazing journey they took to East Timor. And it was, I think, 3,600 miles. Christian gave them a sextant, but they had no charts. Bligh was known as a great navigator by everybody. I think they had 19 men in a ship made for 10, and they survived 45 days on 5 days full rations. I mean, it's just astonishing. But it's funny. Can you imagine Trevor Howard's Bligh if you saw him like starving and suffering? It just wouldn't work, would it? It just. I'm sure he could do it as an actor, but what do you think? They tweak this ever so slightly and hint at it, but they say, the nearest island they're going to go to is Tafua or something like that. I think it is. Yeah, that's right. And he says, no, we'll avoid that, and we're going to go to the next one because and it's 4,000, whatever it is. We're going to, but they actually went to Tafua, and. Yes.
Is that the one? They had the cannibals on the island.
Again, an incredible scene. I mean,
yes.
The more I think about this, I think Anthony Hopkins is so good as Captain Bligh. And you got Bernard Hill there.
I love Bernard Hill. A Titanic reference as well there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that was more or less true. The natives seemed friendly, and then they got more and more sort of hostile, and they ended up like
a couple of the mutineers got killed, didn't they? I think, and they even tied a rope to the boat, and they tried dragging it back to shore. It's as you say, if this was given the time and the production values over, Stephen, say a 10-part mini series or even a 3-series serial, it's a fascinating story. You could go from start to finish, and this would cover a good 10-year period from start to finish.
I mean, Bligh went back and did the breadfruit mission as well.
Yes,
they sent him back to do the mission, and he made it to the West Indies.
Yeah, and then he became governor of, was it New South Wales or somewhere in Australia?
And there was the rum rebellion there.
That's right.
In between that, there was 2 mutinies that happened in English ports, basically. This is where my research comes in.
Yeah, don't claim you haven't been doing any research.
Separate. It's stuff I've done separately for other research. For when I eventually do theoretically get my other podcast going.
That one.
But this long heralded and never realised. But there was 2 mutinies that happened about 7 or 8 years after this that went, several years after Bligh had returned, and the Spithead, which is the port, the area outside Portsmouth where all the ships were moored, basically that area of the English Channel, and then the Nore in London. But the Spithead one particularly was relevant to this because they did kick up a fuss about their objections to the discipline that was being exerted on them as far as whippings and stuff like that, floggings and rations and such. And one of the captains that was removed, along with a vast number of others, was Bligh. So he was the 3 mutinies that he's linked to was the Bounty, Spithead, and then the Rum Rebellion when he was governor. But he doesn't seem to have been directly implicated in Spithead. He just seemed to have been associated with it because of his reputation that he'd carried on due to the because there was a lot of when he got back, and he was found not guilty by the Admiralty, and in some ways actually praised, but there were still those that had been the families, particularly aristocratic families of those that he was trying to condemn, had gone round blackening his name. So his reputation publicly, rather than professionally, was blackened. So he got removed as part of this rebellion in Spithead several years after he'd returned from doing the breadfruit run again, and then he was he was the subject of a rebellion in New South Wales as a governor, like you say. But that was on the cursory glance of it is that he was stopping rum being imported, and therefore that's what caused the rebellion. But in actual fact, what he was doing was stopping the corruption, whereby this rum was coming in, and the vast majority of it was being siphoned off and sold.
Exactly.
So privately, so he kind of has suffered, his reputation has suffered on three levels of being damned for being somebody he wasn't, and it could possibly even be that the Mutiny on the Bounty triple series on Netflix doesn't have to be about the Mutiny on the Bounty. It's actually a biopic of Bligh, because he was a self-made man who was trying to be a captain despite other people getting awarded captaincies just because they happened to be from an aristocratic family, but they didn't have his skills. Yeah. Right. And he struggled for a long time to actually be made a captain. Even in this, he was captain of the ship, but he didn't have the rank of captain.
That's it. He eventually reached the rank of vice admiral. So
eventually,
before he died, and was in the Battle of Copenhagen amongst other things. So his abilities as a seafaring commander aren't in doubt. It's just the way that it's portrayed.
Captain Cook chose him for his second and I think third journeys, because he recognised him as being the best navigator to have.
Fascinating story that, as we say, the three versions of the Bounty, Mutiny on the Bounty, that we sort of discussing today, they all take a different view. They all, and if you were to combine all three, you still wouldn't get the full story.
Yeah. He was younger. I think Bligh was 33 when the voyage, and I'm pretty sure all three actors would have been quite a bit older.
Yeah.
How old was Trevor Howard? It must have been 50, wasn't he?
Yeah. I think in all of the films, the actors were older. I think the closest you get is Mel Gibson in the third one, but the rest of them, they were all substantially older than they actually should have been.
Because I think Christian was 23 when they sailed, and Bligh was 33.
There you go. Yeah.
Can I just read one thing? This is because I did make a load of notes about the real story, just the end of it. That's all.
Yeah.
This is probable events, because we're not sure exactly what happened, but the probable events at Pitcairn saw Christian and 4 other mutineers murdered by Tahitian men in September 1793. The Tahitians themselves being murdered by surviving mutineers, or the wives of murdered mutineers. Christian fathered a son called Thursday October Christian. You probably know there's a chef called Glyn Christian as well.
Yes, the distance relative, yes.
Quintal and McCoy constructed a still, making liquor and drinking a lot. 1798, McCoy committed suicide. Quintal was killed by Adams and Young. Young died of asthma, and Adams remained. And as we said earlier on the DVD, there's this prologue and epilogue where they do that kind of device where you see someone who basically tells the film as a story, and then you return to them at the end. And they made it The Gardener, didn't they?
Richard
was
Hayden,
in. Yeah, it was in Sound of Music. Yeah. But,
there were rumours going on for years and years that his murder was fake, though. Christian's murder. Did you know
he'd returned to England? Yeah. How he would have done that was difficult. I mean, the first contact that the Pitcairns had was quite a while later, about 18 years later, and that was the story then was pieced together, and there was, as you say, there was only one survivor, which I think was Adams, and
that's right.
The rest were either several Tahitian women and the children, basically, and that was it with regards to survivors on the island, and we know that about a decade ago there was some very unsettling news about how the Pitcairn Islands culture had developed.
Which
didn't sort of brought back some discussions about the Mutiny on the Bounty, and I was surprised really that around that time that there wasn't any plan. Nothing came of them retelling the story as well, because I would have thought that the references might have provided ammunition for them to decide to have another go at telling the story. Sort of how the Pitcairn Islands ended up there in the first place. It's because of mutiny, so let's tell the story of the mutiny. But yeah, it was I believe a whaling ship from the United States that discovered them like 18 years later, and the information had been put together. And then there was, there's also the story of those that decided to go back to Tahiti and got picked up, and then the commander that was on the Pandora, which wasn't Bligh. Then basically he was a cruel captain, and some of the prisoners died because the ship crashed, and he refused to let them out of where they were locked up, so they basically drowned because they were still locked and imprisoned. So there is a lot more to it, just sort of after the actual mutiny happened, that isn't portrayed in the films, and obviously it was long enough as it was without getting too much into that, which is why I think there is more to it if somebody decided to invest.
Listen, I think the three of us should get together and write this script. I
think we get Antony to do the research.
I already have.
We'd have to be a bit more accurate. Do you guys, like as you're aware, the three versions that we've been talking about featured, the leading Hollywood heartthrob at the time. Mel Gibson, Marlon Brando, Clark Gable, right? Have you read Captain Bligh's actual description of Fletcher Christian, what he actually looked like?
No.
Right. There's no portrait or exact drawing of what Christian looks like. There are a few drawings out there, like a representation of him. But in Bligh's own words, right, he described him as 5'9" high, blackish or very dark complexion, hair blackish or very dark brown, make strong, a star tattooed on his left breast and tattooed on his back side. His knees stand out a little, and he may be called a little bow-legged. He is subject to violent perspiration, particularly in his hand, so that he soils anything he handles. So, what was the? So, good luck with the casting of that one, chaps, when we actually get this done.
Instead, you get a leprechaun, a leprechaun, the superhero.
Yeah.
Well, what was their real relationship? Because in the later film with Hopkins and Gibson, they're very chummy. Obviously, in the version we're talking about,
the real relationship was that they did actually know each other and had sailed with each other previously, and
only about a year,
And Fletcher Christian was friends with his family, and he's had read stories, bedtime stories to his children and all sorts of things. So they were friendly, and Bligh specifically sought out Christian to be on the ship. So there was already a friendship there, which I think is why, if I remember correctly, the Mel Gibson one, he does appeal to him based upon the friendship and his children, his family. So yes, that's another inaccuracy whereby that relationship existed, whereas it was portrayed as being that they were complete strangers and at odds from the beginning, which is again is dramatic license but not accurate.
It's more simple, I suppose, isn't it? It's taking the simple route of two total opposites.
It makes that whole story of the conflict, more believable in that short space of time that they've got to tell the story, I suppose.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's it.
Anything else anybody would like to add before we wind up here, chaps?
No, that's it. I mean, I think it's very, very entertaining. I do recommend that podcast, History by Hollywood. They take you through the real story of something and then take you through how Hollywood has treated it. And in this case, they talk about all three films, which is how you get a 3-in-1 deal. But I think it's very entertaining. I think, if you've got some sort of surround sound or something, it's definitely,
Oh, watch it on a big screen TV or whatever. Yeah, definitely get the full effect. Definitely get the full effect. Stephen, is it top of the three for you, or is it sort of middling, or even the bottom? Where would you rank this amongst the three?
I think it entirely depends upon what you're wanting from the film. If you're wanting something that is telling you more accurate with regards to the history, then you need to go for the most recent one in the 80s. But if you're going for something that attempts to have a bit more of an epic appearance, with the cinematography and the scope of what it's trying to cover, as well as trying to include the psychodrama of the individuals, then it's this one you need to go for. And if you're just wanting to go for something that's a bit more, a swashbuckling adventure, then you go for the first one. So this one definitely has its place, and I don't think there's bits that the other ones do better than this, but there's also some bits that this does better than the others. So I think it has its place, and if that's what you're wanting from it, then absolutely you seek it out. And as you say, a big screen to be able to take in the full technical of the Tahitian islands and the women. That he certainly is a spectacle. If nothing else, you will get a chuckle out of the accent of Marlon Brando, which is on par with Dick Van Dyke.
At least he tried. Clark Gable didn't.
And yeah, at least he tried. Yeah, but I'm reminded of it when I was watching it again. I was reminded of Robert Downey Jr. when he was doing Sherlock Holmes. That British accent there as well. It was just. What's the one in
Chaplin. Chaplin.
Ocean's 11.
Don Cheadle.
Don Cheadle, who's talking Cockney, but not, because you've got we're needing subtitles for him. Never mind anybody else. So I think this is a film that I can understand where Antony's coming from with regards to his fondness for it. Yeah. It's not for everybody because of the length and because of the subject matter.
Check out Brian James in Tango and Cash as well for a really dodgy English accent.
Oh yes.
But Americans tend to sound like a sort of Cockney spiv from the 1950s when they do. Yeah. They tried to do English accents. So I think I appreciated the fact that Marlon went for something else, not a sort of gore blimey governor.
It was unique, I'll give him that.
It was unique, yeah.
And anybody
I recognise a Cockney spiv wouldn't have worked for somebody who was meant to be an aristocrat from sort of Newcastle way.
Yeah, but you could have played Christian as a sort of working class hero, couldn't you, as well? That would have been another way you could have gone with it.
I was going to say, despite all our criticisms, he's a great film at the end of the day, this movie. And I'm going to spring this on you because I haven't thought about this myself, but we're due a remake, or we're due a Netflix series, or whatever, as we say.
I think the series thing is a great idea. I don't think you necessarily need another film.
But bearing that in mind, right, and what we've said, that Christian was 23 and Bligh was 33, and who would we cast today?
Well, Stephen's a classic film jerks veteran, so I think.
Oh yeah, because that was the feature of them, wasn't it? Yeah, I mean, I've sprung this on you. I haven't even thought about it myself, but the ages were all completely wrong in all three versions that we've seen.
Yeah.
It would be difficult, I think, to find a 23-year-old. I don't know, that would appeal to the audiences, as well as, would a 33-year-old to today's audiences convey that authority that Captain Bligh had? Do we need somebody of Anthony Hopkins or Trevor Howard's standing to make this more acceptable?
I think you're right pinpointing there that you would. The problem is with casting people age-wise with history is that you've got to remember that in a number of cases, people going back into history hundreds of years, life expectancy and such like was shorter, so people aged quicker anyway. So people who, in our terms now, I mean, you can just see in our own generations of things that, what was when we were children, me and Scott, when we were children that were pensioners. Were doddery old women, whereas now, people who are 60, they're people who are still going to gigs and jogging and doing all sorts of things. So you've got to well done, Scott. But I think you could get away with having somebody 10 years older in both respects to be able to fulfil the role, because they would fulfil the criteria of how people aged at the time. I mean, one of the officers in True to Life on the boat was a 15-year-old, who was a young lad who was an officer.
Yeah.
Aristocratic, obviously, but I mean that you can have the movement of maybe 10 years as far as age-wise to allow people to appreciate the maturity of people being different back in those times. But who you would cast is a bit of a minefield, because how you find the people who have the right temperament and CV as far as what characters they can put across. And if you're going to put something out there that does have the action as well as the psychodrama, you're going to have to get some people who are quite good all round actors, rather than just putting the Rock in there.
I was going to say the danger would be any of the Marvel cast. It would be Captain America or
well, no, I'd say it would need to be British people.
Who's the guy? Who's the guy who's played James Hunt in Rush? Was he Thor as well?
Yeah, that's what I mean. There would be somebody from that ilk, wouldn't it?
He's Australian, isn't he? What's his name?
Oh God, there was Chris Evans is Captain America, and it's him, isn't it?
Hemsworth, isn't it?
Chris Hemsworth. That's
yeah.
That would be the danger. Like that would be the danger that would happen. We would get a muscle-bound, all-action hero. But then again, we got it with Clark Gable and Mel Gibson as such, that they were at the time the leading heartthrobs. So, do we want an accurate representation? I think we do. I think we need to make it accurate if we're going to get this remade, guys.
I mean, they'd be wanting to try and put. They'd be wanting to put the likes of Tom Hardy in there somewhere, they wouldn't there? And
that would be the choice. That would be it. Tom Hardy's Bligh.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that would work better than having him as Christian, certainly.
Okay.
I've never seen Master and Commander. Is that any good? Because Russell Crowe seemed to fit the bill, but I guess he's a bit old now.
Older now.
Wasn't there a link between that and the Bounty in the 80s? Didn't they use some of the ships or whatever that they featured in one film was actually reused in Master and Commander? I think I read that somewhere, that there was a link there. But yeah, as far as recasting,
difficult.
It's a bit of a minefield. But I think you'd have to pick British people to play the British parts, at least. Not have British people playing the Tahitians, because that's obviously daft. But and they could do a full examination if they did that of where people's different motivations lay, and rather than just have it as that there was one villain of the piece, and that was Captain Bligh, because from my view, I mean, the Tahitian king was the biggest villain in all of this, really. Just because of the fact that he was making pronouncements about as far as when the mutineers turned up at the island and said, we want to take several men with us to sail the boat, and he basically just said, I'll give you some men. I thought, well, don't they have a choice in that? You're just going to send them off, take them away from their families and send them off, and that's it. They're just done, so maybe the worst dictator in the entire thing was the Tahitian king, but there's a multitude of different aspects that could be better examined with more time, and now with there being a better view of history to be able to not just have such a simplistic view as well.
Yeah.
So hopefully somebody from Netflix is listening to this, or Amazon, and will put that out for us. But
there you go.
And give us a credit as well.
We've done all the hard work for you, lads. It's there. And as long as they don't fall down that trap of when we first tried to record this episode a few days ago, and technical difficulties and noise at Steven's end of people breaking into his house and stuff. I reminded you guys of the very short-lived version of this, the musical version, starring David Essex and Sunita. This long forgotten West End production, and if you can cast David Essex as Fletcher Christian and Sunita as the love interest, anything is possible, chaps. That's all I'll say.
Well, we'll look forward to the Netflix series starring Danny Dyer then.
Danny Dyer and Miley Cyrus. Yeah, I can't wait. It'll be brilliant. Let's leave it at that. That's been the Stinking Pause. We'll be back the three of us, hopefully very soon. We've got a lot more episodes lined up with other guest presenters. So take care, guys. See you both very soon. Thanks a lot.
See you later.
Take care.
The management of this theater suggests that for the greater entertainment of your friends who have not yet seen the picture, you will not divulge to anyone the secret of the ending.
Nostradamus, that infernal jamboree is worse than two cats on a fence.
You dudes get lost now, you hear?
Good night, ladies.
Good night, sir.
The need for cash was dire, and producer Aaron Rosenberg knew it. He had a question for Marlon. What about a remake of the MGM classic Mutiny on the Bounty, with Brando in the role of Fletcher Christian? At first, Marlon was unenthusiastic. He didn't believe a simple shot-for-shot restatement of the old Clark Gable, Charles Laughton epic would suffice for the modern viewer. However, his curiosity had been aroused. He got hold of the Charles Nordhoff, James Norman Hall historical novel from which the movie had been adapted. It turned out to be part one of a trilogy. The first book concerned the actual revolt against the tyrannical Captain Bligh. The second, neglected volume, Men Against the Sea, followed Bligh's astonishing survival in a small boat with a bunch of loyal crewmen and short rations. The third, Pitcairn's Island, told of the mutineers in later years, how some enjoyed their freedom, how others were hunted down, brought back to England and hanged, how the remaining seamen turned against one another, resulting in recrimination and murder. The latter portions of the story fascinated Marlon. He agreed to do the film with this proviso. I want to investigate what happened to the sailors after the mutiny. Why did they go to Pitcairn Island and, within 2 years, kill each other off? What is there in human nature that makes men violent, even in an island paradise? That's what would interest me. The demand seemed reasonable enough to Rosenberg. He assigned novelist Eric Ambler to do a scenario incorporating all 3 books and persuaded MCA that this would be the most remarkable Brando film to date. Surely it would be the most remunerative. Playing the part of Fletcher Christian, the star would earn a flat fee of $500,000, plus 10% of the gross, plus $5,000 a day for every day the film went past its 6-month schedule, practically a guarantee given the complexities of production, plus $10,000 a week to cover overtime expenses. Additional bait was dangled. Most of the movie would be shot on location in Tahiti, the nirvana Marlon had visualized when still a miserable cadet. He succumbed. Privately, Brando was not so pleased with the man assigned to steer this bounty, Sir Carroll Reed. It was hard to believe the studio's claim that it was aiming for another Ben-Hur, MGM's mega-hit of 1959. Sir Carroll's specialty was the intimate psychological drama, not the widescreen blockbuster. The Fallen Idol, for example, explored the mind and loyalties of a boy who witnesses a killing. The Third Man, Graham Greene's atmospheric thriller, was basically the story of 2 men, one honorable and drunk, the other immoral and romantic, who compete for the attention of a woman in depleted post-war Vienna. A meeting was arranged between director and star. It was not a success. Instead of discussing the material at hand, Marlon went on about the California rapist Carl Chessman, who had been sentenced to death. When the discussion finally got around to Bounty, Reed found the actor's suggestions useless. Brando had only the most rudimentary knowledge of Tahiti, derived mainly through old photographs and the paintings of Gauguin. Brando's request for historical accuracy was dismissed out of hand. To defuse the conflict, Rosenberg stepped in, reminding his star that no one in the audience would know or care about what British sailors or Tahitian natives wore in 1789. Authenticity was fine for documentaries, but the tale of Bligh versus crew was cluttered with salts and officers, It needed all the sex and spectacle it could get. Marlon was anxious to get to the Society Islands. He accepted the producer's argument. The events of the first few weeks could have come from an Yves Lenoir farce. A group of allegedly glamorous Tahitian women, vahines in their native language, had been hired on the spot. Their come-hither looks turned out to be unusable because their teeth were marred by brown stains and streaks, the result of chewing betel nuts. To cover these flaws, they were required to wear temporary dentures. Some 5,000 were flown in from the United States. The vahines were delighted, took the teeth caps, and vanished to admire themselves in their home mirrors. They went missing for days. An MGM official came up with the solution. Extras were required to pick up their dentures in the morning and hand them in at the end of the day. The sand was equally disappointing. It was black powdered lava, disappointing to the eye and ugly to the camera. Tons of white sand had to be trucked in from a faraway beach. Nevertheless, there were compensations. The vahines, as well as some Polynesian youths, were compliant to the point of passivity. A wink, a nod, and they were in bed with the flirter. Hetero or homosexual, it didn't matter. There were no obligations beyond the moment of pleasure. This was more like it. Marlon relaxed in an atmosphere of total indulgence, auditioning local women for the role of Fletcher Christian's South Sea inamorata. He settled on a lush, empty-headed 19-year-old hotel worker named Tarita. This was the beginning of many disasters for the film. Early on, Tarita had trouble remembering her lines, and her scenes were repeated day after day until she got them right, at a cost to MGM of at least $50,000 per diem. Naturally, she bedded down with Marlon, but so did other locals. In this, he was no different from other members of the cast and crew, who slept around more or less at will. Many, including Marlon, contracted gonorrhea, and an expensive California physician had to be flown in with serum and antibiotics. Pregnancies forced some young extras to leave. They were replaced by even less talented ladies. A 40-something technician fell for a voluptuous lass and, alongside her parents, announced their engagement, even though he had been married for more than 10 years. Friends eventually persuaded him to give up the fantasy, but it was a hard sell. Complications continued. While preliminaries got underway, the weather turned foul. 17 inches of rain fell one day, and storms were ceaseless. Then there was the problem of the script. Ambush plot and dialogue were found wanting in character development, and new men were brought in for repair work. First, Borden Chase, best known for westerns, doctored the dialogue and plot. Then Charles Lederer, who had earned his first screen credit in 1931, came in to fix the fixes. And then there was the problem of Marlon himself. He adored Tahiti, and did everything he could to delay a return to California. On the very first day of shooting, he told the director, "I'm sorry to see this day come. It means one day sooner that we'll be going back to the States." Consciously and unconsciously, he made life difficult for his fellow performers, insisting on retakes for nearly every scene. Richard Harris, a hard drinker but a dead serious actor, was thrown by Brando's improvisatory technique. So was Trevor Howard. As the martinet Captain Bligh, he had many scenes with the star, and abhorred Marlon's unpredictability. "You never know where you are," he fumed. Brando could drive a saint to hell in a dog sled. Squabbles, rewrites, and inclement weather forced more postponements. Having indulged Marlon well past the point of fiscal sanity, MGM finally put on the brakes. Because it was impossible to fire the star, the director took the fall. As a crowd of paparazzi and columnists descended, Studio Flax blandly asserted that Sir Carol Reed had decided to move on to other assignments, and that MGM was delighted to welcome Louis Milestone as the HMS Bounty's new skipper. Recalling the pacifist spirit of All Quiet, Marlon was deeply respectful when they conferred about the picture. Milestone rolled up his sleeves and prepared to take over. He would soon regret his decision. The Bounty script was divided into thirds: the mutiny, the life on the island, and the fallout and fatal internecine strife among mutineers. These sections were written by different men at different times, and the parts rarely meshed. Marlon continued to be troubled by the personality of Fletcher Christian. Before him loomed the image of Gable strutting in the 1935 film. Clark was marvelous in a lot of movies, Marlon maintained, but in Mutiny, he was just another fellow in a funny hat. To put some distance between the Fletchers, he proceeded to make his mutineer a high-minded, overprivileged fop. That put the wardrobe department in a delicate situation. Marlon's weight fluctuated by the week. At times his belly bulged over his pants. He went through 52 pairs, and he insisted on looking taller than his natural height by wearing awkward lifts in his shoes. All along, Marlon's private life echoed the film production's chaos.